Over the course of a handful of videos, I've been taking an overview and picking my way through some of the 12-inch Star Trek figures from Playmates that were released in the 90s. This is a pretty interesting line because it's quite expansive in that there's a lot of releases in this 12-inch scale, and yet none of them ever feel quite complete. We had the Star Trek Insurrection line, which produced most of the crew figures but not all of them, and didn't produce any aliens from the Next Generation era, or at least not the movie era. Then we had a look at some of the aliens that were produced, and a lot of them were produced for the original series, but only one for the Next Generation era, and nothing at all for Deep Space Nine or Voyager. Crew figures equally suffered in that we only got a handful of releases to support Deep Space Nine and Voyager. We got a Benjamin Sisko, a 7 of 9, and a Captain Janeway. Instead, interestingly, much like Arthur Asylum or Diamond Select would do later on, Playmates focused their energy on the original series. And what we have in this 12-inch line is as complete a set as we're ever likely to get. Because not only did we get a handful of aliens to support this line, but we actually managed to get the entire bridge crew as well, and even a couple of variants. And I'm going to start today by looking at an unexpected release, which was Captain Pike. This is a pretty interesting release because although he makes only a fleeting appearance in the original series, he's quite a significant character as he was intended to be the original captain of the Enterprise. Of course, the pilot wasn't picked up and they reshot it with William Shatner, and the rest, as they say, is history. Nevertheless, it's very cool to actually have this figure because he is, strictly speaking, part of the canon. Plus, I've personally always had a bit of a soft spot for the Cage, and I really like some of the costume design elements on this character. So let's start by taking a look at the packaging. Now, if you've seen any of the previous videos, you probably know what to expect by this point, so let's go through it. The packaging for all of these 12-inch figures is in this oddly shaped oblong box, which has a panel which is sort of slanted to the side, it's slight diagonal, and on that side we can see the Star Trek logo, and of course we can see the Enterprise, which is a really nicely painted image. It's very visually striking and it looks very displayable. On the front, of course, we have this sort of nebula, this gaseous space scene, which is very nicely done. We can see the stars, we can see a planetoid or a moon, and then we have some of this sort of orangey yellow gas. And I think this looks really nice, very presentable, very displayable, and of course we have that window display there to show each figure in the packaging, which looks really good. My favourite thing about the packaging though is the fact that the cover opens up, and inside we have a larger window display where we can see the figure, but also we can see that the Enterprise goes on into the interior inlay. We can see that artwork there, the saucer shaped disc continues there and comes out the other side of the flap. So it actually has like a multiple dimensions going on. I think this looks really nice, very attractive, and they've done such a nice job of it. Meanwhile, on the left hand side, of course, we can have a little bit of information about the character, and in this case it's talking a lot about the Cage, which is brilliant stuff. And then on the reverse, every figure has the exact same text box with images, and this is charting the Star Trek history, so it's a bit of a run through of its inception right the way up to Voyager. I'm not a huge fan of this approach, but I do think it's interesting because it is pretty unique. I don't think I've ever seen this approach to any other figures, and it certainly seems to be the antithesis of what we would expect to see today. Obviously, lots and lots of text here, and no images of any of the figures, no artwork, nothing else to do with the line of the series, which is an interesting approach. And when Pike is freed from his packaging, he doesn't disappoint. I have to say, this is probably one of my favourite figures in the entire line. I'm particularly impressed with the fact that they chose to give him his blazer, which I think is a really fantastic choice and really helps him stand out. Now, when it comes to the head sculpt, I think this is another example of where they've done a really nice job catching the likeness of the actor. Now, in this case, as with so many in the Playmates line, the likeness is a little bit soft. Some of the features are a bit soft here and there, so it's not quite as sharp as you might like, but you can instantly look at this figure and know who it's meant to be, I feel. And I think that is the hallmark of a really good likeness, and I think they've caught some of the details here that are very nice. What it needed, of course, was a little bit more texture. It needed a bit of a grey wash going through the hair, maybe some extra lines, but overall I think they've done a really nice job. I'm very happy with this sculpt. As I said, I absolutely love that he comes with the jacket. I think this is a really neat touch. Of course, we do only see this in the pilot. We never see it again in any other Trek episodes, but it is very nice that they bothered to include it here, and it does make him really stand out in the collection, in my opinion. So it's a nice light touch as well, so it's very easy to remove if you want, so you can have the just the standard gold uniform underneath, which is very nicely presented and well done. But as I said, having this jacket on there just helps differentiate him, helps make him a bit more visually interesting in the collection, and it makes the figure just look a little bit better, in my opinion. Now, sadly, all of the figures in this line do suffer from the same problem when it comes to the hands. They have a very hard plastic hand. Rather than opting for the Hasbro approach where they had, like, say, a rubber hand, this is a firm plastic. So it's not very malleable, it's very difficult to get certain accessories in there because it's not really going to budge without danger of snapping something. And, of course, there is that ungainly quality to it where it's not quite a fist, but it's not an open hand either, so it kind of can look a little bit limiting and a bit strange. Likewise, for the most part, these figures tended to have a hard moulded black plastic boot as the base, and the trousers will come down with the cuffs and just slide over them. I think this is a really good design. I think this looks really well. Obviously, it's not so great if you ever want to change the costume of the characters, but if you take the figure on its own terms, then I think this works very, very nicely. The body molds and the articulation scheme for every figure in this line is pretty much identical, so I'll just run through it the once here. He has a swivel at the head, so he can spin his head right the way around, but sadly it's not a ball joint, it just turns from side to side. He does, however, have a ball joint in the shoulder, so his arms can kick up and out to a degree, which is great, and he's got a single jointed elbow, bending it to about 90 degrees. He does have a swivel at the wrist, so his wrist can rotate 360 degrees, and he's also got a ball joint in the waist, so he can swivel from side to side. He can look forwards and backwards a little bit, and then he has those hinge hips as well, meaning his legs can kick out to the side, they can kick forwards, backwards, and there's another single jointed knee, meaning that bends to about 90 degrees, and that's it. Sadly, there's nothing else. There's no other swivels, there's no ankle articulation or anything else like that. Now, most of the figures in the classic series 12-inch line come with pretty much the same accessories. They generally come with phasers, communicators, and tricorders. Although, pleasingly, Pike comes with a variation of these accessories, different molds, different colour schemes, which of course is entirely accurate and authentic to what we see on screen. And he has absolutely no problems holding them whatsoever. I've always been particularly impressed with this phaser. In some ways, I think I prefer it. There's something there very, very 50s sci-fi about this design. I think it looks really, really cool. And they've done a really nice job sculpting it and painting it. And likewise with his tricorders, lots of different colours going on there. And I think they've done a really excellent job. And again, he holds them both perfectly and it looks really, really good. So all in all, they put a lot of effort into this figure. He comes with unique pieces, obviously his accessories and his jacket, and I think they've done a very nice job with the overall presentation. And I think to this day, this is the only 12-inch version of this character that we have, so he's a pretty unique, interesting piece. Next up we have Bones McCoy. Now Bones is a character I have a lot of love and affection for, and I'm really, really glad to have him in this line. However, we do start to see one of the problems of using the same sculpt for every figure, is that obviously he looks far too bulky, too muscular for the actual character. And the head sculpt, while it is pretty decent, suffers from this softness, which is kind of detrimental in the case of DeForest Kelley, because obviously he has a lot more interesting features, a lot more lines and nuances to his face than some of the other younger cast members would have had. So having a softer likeness on this character doesn't work quite as well. It doesn't look quite right, unfortunately. But that said, it is still clearly there. I think you can still definitely recognise this is meant to be Bones McCoy, and I think it looks pretty good, but as I said, it's very a toyetic approach. Now his tunic is very nicely done. As with all the figures, the insignia is stitched into the costume, which I really love that approach. I think it's very, very nicely done, and it's nice to see the gold of the rank going around the cuffs as well. All nicely done. It's nice that it's sewn into the trousers, so it always looks tight. It looks like it fits properly, which is fantastic stuff. The only criticism I have of this tunic is the fact that it is a very powder blue, and it just looks a little bit too blue for what we see on screen. It looks a little bit too bright. Maybe should have been dialed back a little bit, but nevertheless, at least it is bright and colourful, and I'd always rather it was brighter than darker. Also, you can see the problems with the hand molds when it comes to certain accessories. None of them can ever really hold their communicator as well as, say, Pike can with his, because of the sculpt of it. It's too bulky to really fit nicely in their grip, and so it ends up looking a bit clunky and a bit silly like this. But I think they've done a very nice job of the tricorders. The sculpt is really good, the paint apps are very nicely applied, and there's even a sticker in there to make it look like it's the panels lit up and glowing and telling them things, which is pretty cool. The only criticism I have of the tricorder is that they tend to put it in the packaging so that it's kind of curved, that the plastic handle is curved, and so it can come out a little bit warped and look a little bit odd if you don't spend a lot of time straightening it out and trying to reform that plastic. So something to be aware of. Now, it might sound like I've been a bit overly harsh on Dr. McCoy, and to be honest, a lot of things I was picking up there aren't just unique to McCoy, it's across all these figures. But overall, I think this is a really nice figure, and again, another worthwhile addition to the collection. Next up we have Scotty, and I think the most striking thing about this figure is the vibrancy and the deepness of the red on the tunic, which I think is very striking and really nicely done. Once again, the head sculpt is pretty solid. It is soft, of course, when it comes to certain features, but overall, I think they've done a pretty decent job of capturing the likeness of James Doohan. I think it's a pretty faithful recreation of what we see on screen. And as we've seen on the other figures, the tunic is very nicely done. We have those gold bands around the cuffs, and we have the insignia. And you'll notice that the symbol within this insignia is accurate. It's what we see on screen. It's different for each class of officer, and it's very nicely done being sewn in there, so I think this looks pretty solid. And overall, it's another nice addition to the line. Now, there's not a lot making him that different, obviously his red tunic, and he also comes with a handful of different accessories, which sadly I don't have to hand, but he does come with a couple of engineering-esque props that we see from the show, which is pretty cool. Moving on, we have Chekov, and the thing you'll notice with these figures when they're brand new is just how vibrant those tunics are, and they have a nice feel to them, which, because there's kind of a felt quality that kind of wears away over time, but when it's brand new out the box, they feel very, very nice. Now, Chekov is one I've sat on for a very long time without actually opening, and you can see that he's got a couple of lines where the tags have been keeping him in place, those twisty ties, so it has left an impression on his costume, so that's something to be aware of. The likeness this time around, I have to say, is a lot weaker, even given it the latitude of being, having softer features as they all do. This doesn't seem to be quite as strong a head sculpt in my opinion. The hair looks fine, but otherwise, I don't know, and I'm not really seeing a lot of Walter Koenig in this likeness. Also, somehow, it almost looks like the head is a little bit too small for the body as well. It doesn't look quite in proportion. And again, that is the problem, obviously, of using the same bodies for each of these figures, as I mentioned before, because they do look too muscular, too big in certain circumstances. In this case, it just doesn't look right. But that said, it's still a very nice figure. Obviously, this is a nice line of toys all in all. So by now you're probably wondering why I haven't covered Kirk or some of the other primary characters yet, and that's because sadly I don't yet own them, although they are on my wish list. I'm trying to track them down. But they did release a Captain Kirk. Now, he wasn't a standard release, he was a special release as part of what they called the Masterpiece Edition from the Captain series. Now, they only actually released 2 figures in this format, although the plan was originally to release Benjamin Sisko and Janeway in the same manner before they became standard releases. But these Masterpiece figures came in this oversized packaging with this very nice flap cover that you lift up, and inside we can see the figure, but he also comes with a book. So in this case, obviously, it's about Captain Kirk, then Picard is about Captain Picard, and so on. Now, it's very difficult to judge or give an opinion on a figure if I haven't got it in hand. But that said, I think there's a reasonable amount of certainty I can take with certain elements of the figure. Of course, it would be reusing the same body mould, and the costume, I imagine, will be pretty similar to what we see on Chekov. So, pretty solid stuff. In terms of how it looks in these photos, the sculpt looks to be the same one as was released on the Romulan Commander Captain Kirk variant, which I really, really liked. I think it was a really strong likeness. Again, soft features, but a very good likeness of William Shatner. So this would definitely do for me. And I think the figure looks to be in perfect proportion. So this looks like a good one. I think this body mold works very well for Captain Kirk. And I think overall this is a nice looking figure in terms of its presentation in its box, if nothing else. So then, what about Mr. Spock? Of course, it is recycling the same body mould, so it may not look entirely screen accurate when you put all these figures together or be in the same height and size and shape, But I don't think it hurts Spock too badly. Looking at these photos here, everything seems to be in proportion. Their head sculpt looks to be pretty solid, I have to say. I think this is a pretty nice likeness of Leonard Nimoy. I can't really see anything to fault it from here, although obviously it can change when it's in hand. But from what I can tell, this looks like a really nice figure all in all. He's also a little bit different in the fact that he does come with the Vulcan salute as well, so he gets away from one of those clunky hands, which I think is a really nice touch. So Playmates definitely get kudos for that. The only thing I'm not sure of though is the blue of the tunic, and he seems to have the opposite problem of what we saw with the Dr. McCoy figure, in that his tunic seems to be too dark. If anything, it's too dark a shade of blue, whereas McCoy's was obviously, I felt, was too bright. So a nice contrast somewhere in the middle of these two figures probably would have been ideal. Or at the very least, give them both the same tunic so that at least they're consistent in the collection, because it is, I suspect they're going to stand out and look kind of odd when they're together. They did also release an Uhura figure as well, which is pretty interesting because there are very, very few female characters in the 12-inch scale line. So it's really nice to see this. It would be really interesting to have it in hand because unfortunately I don't have any of the female characters, so I can't really comment when it comes to articulation or what the body mold is like. But it looks like they've done a pretty nice job of this figure all in all. And yeah, I think it'd be a good addition to the collection. They also released a Sulu as well. Now this looks like it's just basically recycled what we saw with the Chekov figure. The only difference here seems to be the head. Otherwise, it's pretty much identical. So hard to see from here how accurate, how good the head sculpt is. I think it looks like it's a little bit better than the Chekov. It seems to be more in proportion in terms of his head versus the body, which is good. And yeah, from what I can tell here, this looks pretty decent. And then finally, there was a variant of Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock from A Piece of the Action, which is an unusual but pretty cool choice. Now, I think these figures may have been exclusive releases to certain stores in the US, but I think they're quite nicely done. It's nice to see them with their trilby. They seem to still come with some of their accessories like the communicator and whatnot, and I really like their gangster outfits. I think this is really cool. I think they've just recycled the head sculpts. I don't think there's anything different about them from what I can tell here, but these look like really nice figures. I would love to get my hands on them. And that, as they say, is that. There's my overview of the 12-inch Playmates Star Trek, the classic series, or the original series, figures. Certainly, there's a lot of things to criticise with these figures if we're judging by today's standards. They all use the same body mould, they all have the same basic articulation scheme, which could have been improved, but was still pretty good for its time, I have to say. And I think the likenesses for the time were very good, given of course, that these were made primarily to be released in toy stores with the idea of children picking them up as well as collectors. I think they have a really collector-friendly quality, whilst at the same time appealing to children with their more simple toyetic designs. I think they're really appealing. Even now, as a collector, I really like having these figures, and I still avidly try and pick them up whenever I can find them, although it is becoming increasingly more difficult over the years. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.